As I mentioned in the start, we have a guest joining us. In fact, he's in studio. In fact, he was giving me a little cue there because I couldn't think what ADL stood for. But John Guandolo is in studio, and I love having him here. He's been here before. I want to remind our listeners briefly who John Guandolo is. He's the founder of a group called Understanding the Threat. He is also a U.S. Naval Academy graduate. He served as an infantry reconnaissance officer in the United States Marines. He's a combat veteran. He served as a special agent in the FBI from 1996 to 2008, was recruited out of the FBI by the Department of Defense to conduct strategic analysis of the Islamic threat in America. He's president and founder, as I said, of Understanding the Threat. John, great to have you.
Great to be back here. Thanks for having me again, Debbie.
So quickly, if you would, just tell our listeners what Understanding the Threat is all about before we dive into our big story for today. What's it all about?
So Understanding the Threat is the only organization in America that actually gives tools to police, citizens, elected officials, community leaders at the local, state, federal level to not only identify jihadi networks in their local area, but tools also to dismantle those networks and go after them, whether you're a citizen, police officer, a mayor, city council member, school board official, etc.
Okay, so you mentioned, I had this question for later in the interview, but since you used the term, what do you mean by jihadi networks?
So anytime I use terms that deal with Islam, I use the definitions that Islam teaches those words mean. So in Islam, a jihadi is somebody who wages jihad, which in Islamic law is defined as warfare against non-Muslims to establish Islam.
Okay, so the network would be anyone who's part of an organization doing that, right?
Yeah, any Muslim individual who's Sharia adherent, who's working to establish an Islamic state under Sharia. That's what a jihadi is.
Okay, so not every Muslim in America, you're not saying every Muslim in America is a jihadi, right?
No, I mean, what Islam's purpose, according to Islam, is to establish Allah's divine law, Sharia, on the earth. But there are people who self-identify as Muslim who, for whatever reason, don't want to do that, don't want to participate. So no, Sharia is the defining line, certainly legally here in the United States.
Okay, so I want to just tell our listeners, I watched a film this morning, which John had mentioned a while ago. I think it came out in July of this year. July, I think, yeah.
Right around then.
Okay, and it's called The Continuum of Jihad. If nothing else you do after this show, I want you to go to our website, americancommunitytalk.org, under shows, drop down, list of links. Will take you right to that video, The Continuum of Jihad. And the reason is this. Up until recently, many Americans did not realize that what we're experiencing in this country and watching happen in Western Europe and all over the world is actually a continuation of the teachings of Islam from the time of its founding, from the conduct of its founder Muhammad, and from the time of the founding of Islam till today. This jihad that John Guandolo was just mentioning to us has been going on sometimes in very extreme forms, very, very forward, very pushing, very growing of the jihadi, of the establishment of Islam, and then sometimes not slowing down because the teachings changed and slowing down because they got pushed back a little bit. But one thing that I think will just help you realize how serious this issue is, there's a link, or there's a portion that's in this film. I want to ask Matt, the wonderful producer, to have that ready to play. This is a short clip it's about a 3 or 4 minute portion of this Continuum of Jihad film that I'm urging you to watch. It's a very short portion in there, and I've even shortened it down more to play a short clip to show you in a visual map, just to watch what Muhammad's followers did in terms of engaging in aggressive conquest Islam, forcing Islam on non-Muslims around the world, around their sphere of influence, what they did just in the 400 plus years after its founding. Is that right?
Yeah, all the way till the 1920s, yes.
Well, all the way till
today. If you
today.
watch the whole thing, right.
Yeah, but I wanted to ask Matt if he can just play this shortened version with sound if we can. So there's the world founded by Islam, and here they go. if you didn't know what I was showing you, the green area, so Islam, founded by Muhammad, and the whole Mecca Medina area, his followers, after Muhammad died, spread Islam by brutal, grotesque force onto non-Muslims all over that part of the world. These were not Muslims going like Christian evangelicals might and say, hey, let me share the Bible with you and tell you about Jesus and salvation and redemption and forgiveness. These are people forcing conversion to Islam under threat of death. That was what the history of Islam was. So now getting back to you, I want to ask you one other kind of basic question before I get into what I really want to talk about your trial. But so the idea of jihad you're just talking about is engaging in war to essentially force Islam on others. You have a fancier way to say it, but it's to force Islam on others. But in addition to violent jihad, which is what much of Islamic history is, there's another way in which Islam is spread. They use the term cultural or civilizational jihad. Can you explain that?
Sure. So again, for your audience, the purpose of Islam, according to Islam, which they teach to children and at the highest schools of Islamic jurisprudence, the purpose of Islam is to make Allah's divine law the law of the land everywhere. The vehicle to do that is called jihad, which is warfare. But within that warfare, it's everything. It's information operations, it's political warfare, it's military warfare, it's propaganda, and deception is absolute a core of Islamic teaching, because it's better to deceive those who are non-Muslim in order to make Allah's divine law the law of the land than to allow Allah's law of the not to be the law of the land. And so this civilization jihad is like a massive counterintelligence operation.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's showing up dressed nicely, acting nicely to a pastor, a congressman, a mayor, a police chief, whoever it is, and saying, I'm here to help. And this is what I'd like to do to help, because we all want the same thing, but they don't want the same thing. If you actually look at who they are and what they say when they're not talking to non-Muslims, when it's Muslims talking to Muslims, they say very clearly, they want an Islamic state under Sharia, because that's what Islam is. And that's really the essence of civilization jihad.
Actually, I meant to one other introductory point, which relates back to the beginning of your film. You talked about Muhammad as everyone knows he's a prophet, the founder of Islam, or they call him a prophet and the founder of Islam. But part of what inspires modern day Muslims, and has since its founding of Islam, is how Muhammad lived his life and what devout Muslims are taught about following Muhammad's life. So can you talk a little bit about how Muhammad engaged, once he had this revelation and he discovered created Islam, discovered Islam, how he lived his life in terms of spreading it, what he did, and then the teachings that say you've got to do what he says.
Right. So in the Quran, numerous times, it says that Muhammad is the perfect example. One of the quotes is exactly that he's an exalted standard of conduct for all Muslims for all times. And so since his death in 632 AD, you've seen Muslims simply continue that example. And I think for people, people ask, should I read the Quran? Should I read the Hadith? Should I read the Tafsir and all this stuff? And I just say no. If you just read the biography of Muhammad and you understand that the Quran, which in Islam means God said, Muhammad's the perfect example. And you see that in the authoritative biography, the life of the Prophet Muhammad.
By whom?
Well, there are different translations, but okay. This was written in the 8th century.
Okay.
So we don't have the current edition is not the complete, but it's as complete as historically we can have it. And in the Islamic world, it's the life of the Prophet Muhammad is the singular translation, or the singular authoritative biography of Muhammad. It's not the only one, but it's the most authoritative. And if you just look at the table of contents, and what do you've got? You've got battles, raids, killing certain people, the beheading of 900 Jews after the Battle of Trench, which Muhammad himself takes part in. Muhammad participating in standing next to a person who he orders to be tortured, allowing the taking of sex slaves, commanding Muslims, saying, I, Muhammad, have been commanded by Allah to wage war against the non-Muslims until they testify there's no God but Allah. So that's the example, and that's all they've been doing. So to your other question about are all Muslims jihadis, listen, that's what Muslims are required to do. Muslims that don't do that do not constitute a different version of Islam. And that's the key.
We're going to get to that later. There was a great piece on your website that was about a conference that happened in Minnesota on September 10th this year. There was at University of Minnesota, and there were someone on your site, I don't know if you wrote it, but a piece about these people presenting that we are here to essentially propose or lay out for you the peaceful form of Islam. But we'll get to that a little later. So so Muhammad, just to really be clear, our listeners got that. He personally engaged in this slaughter of Jews at the Battle of Trench, somewhere between 500 and 900 Jews slaughtered by them at his hand or at his direction. And just to get the idea, that's known to pretty much every Muslim in the world.
That's right.
And he's the perfect man whose example should be followed.
That's right.
Okay, we'll come back to that later. So now, fast forwarding to you, so you have understanding the threat. You're trying to raise awareness about the actual teachings of Islam. One thing I learned from you, I have to say, John, I don't know when it was, years ago, but you always talk about the idea, instead of going to modern critics of Islam, and which then the Islamic community can say, well, that's not what we teach, that's just some critic, why listen to him? You frequently go back to what the Quran says, what the Hadith say, what the actual writings and the actual history of Islam is. It takes away the argument that you're misrepresenting. And I do try to do that. Can't always get there. You have an amazing memory for so much of that detail. But in any case, you have UTT, understanding the threat. You're working to raise awareness in America of what Islamic doctrine is. So you're up in Minnesota, which is the home of thousands of Somalian Islamic refugees in this country. And I don't know what the number is right now. Is it like 25,000? Do you know how many?
Oh, no, it's probably closer to 80,000 or more.
Okay.
Some estimates are over 100,000, right?
In Minnesota.
And specifically in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area.
Okay, so you have a very large Islamic Somalian community there. So I want to get around to, you were involved in a trial just a few months ago, or last month actually,
Right.
here in Texas, involving an incident that really had its genesis in 2016 when you were up in the Minnesota area trying to do the UTT job of spreading about the danger of radical Islam. So can you just tell, basically, you ran across a guy there who was then the sheriff, Stanek. Can you talk about that, how you guys got started connecting in 2016?
Yeah, so let me start. So our team, we had been to, and I had been to Minnesota a number of times at the behest of people up there to come up. I had talked to numerous citizens. I'd actually gone into some of the communities where the jihadis lived and looked at some of the, I actually spoke with some of the police officers, looked at police reports that were made public after incidences, things like that. And so we had really done our homework. So by the time we got there in the fall of 2016, before the election, literally just 2 weeks before the presidential election.
Oh, okay.
And we spent an entire week there. I started up near the Canadian border and had meetings during the day and then would give presentations at night. And in one case, we had over 200 citizens at one of the presentations. And then the next day, drive, south a couple hours and have more meetings, do another presentation, sometimes meet with police chiefs, sheriffs, mayors, then would come down, all the way, working our way towards Minnesota while two of my other colleagues were doing the same thing, but they had gone kind of in a different direction and doing different areas, doing the same thing. And then at the end of the week, we met back in Minneapolis and had another event. And then what we did was we sat down and compared notes, plus all of the research and work we had done prior to ever coming there, because I had spoken in Minnesota numerous times prior to this. And then I wrote an article. And it's called, in Minneapolis, the Twin Cities are lost. In this war, the Twin Cities are lost. And it literally lays out that at the time, in 2016, October, the governor, the lieutenant governor, the mayor of Minneapolis, the assistant, or the U.S. attorney, Andy Luger, the sheriff, Rich Stanek, all of them were working with easily identifiable Muslim Brotherhood, jihadi, terrorist groups like Hamas, doing business as the Council on American Islamic Relations, Muslim American Society, and others there in Minneapolis. And we're not only working with them, we're presenting themselves at public events, openly praising these organizations that the Department of Justice has identified as Muslim Brotherhood organizations in many cases. And in the case of CARE, a Hamas organization, that's Hamas being a foreign terrorist organization. So then we published the article, and that's the genesis for then what happened about 8 months later in July, or that's about right, July of 2017, when I actually met the sheriff at the National Sheriff's Conference.
I want to jump in and say, again, if you go to our website, americacanwetalk.org, homepage under shows, go down, list of links. The article John's mentioning there, it's called In This War, Minnesota's Twin Cities Are Lost, full of information. And so I want to do two clarifying points before we get to the next thing. So you mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood. Many people in America, many Muslims in America claim it's just an organization to build brotherly love or something. So quickly, the genesis of Muslim Brotherhood, like, are they really, is it fair to tie them to terrorism? Is it fair to tie them to wrongdoing?
Yeah, very fair. So let's first start with the Muslim Brotherhood is the same objective as ISIS, the Islamic State, and Al-Qaeda. So let's start there. Hamas, a foreign designated terrorist organization, is an inherent part of the International Muslim Brotherhood. That's an inherent part. The Muslim Brotherhood leadership teaches that you must establish Allah's law in the land, and that you must fight the enemies and tyrants of Islam to establish an Islamic State. And their history is one where senior Muslim Brotherhood leaders have worked with Al-Qaeda. You've got Muslim Brotherhood in the United States working directly with people working against the United States. You've got documents that come from inside CARE's headquarters saying they want to work with Osama bin Laden. So yes, the Muslim Brotherhood is a threat to the United States.
And CARE, you mentioned CARE, another organization that really tries to hold itself out as we're here to build bridges, we're the good guys. CARE, you use the expression, and I've used it too, CARE is Hamas, but very quickly where CARE came from, why you say that?
CARE was created in 1994 as a part of the U.S. Muslim Brotherhood's Palestine Committee, which is Hamas in the United States. The other three organizations, the Islamic Association of Palestine, U.S. government said that's Hamas, the Holy Land Foundation, Hamas, the United Association for Studies and Research, Hamas, and then there's CARE. And the only difference is CARE is the only one that hasn't been identified by the government and indicted, which is outrageous in and of itself because it's all part of the same.
So CARE was not an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy...
They were not only an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation trial.
Right.
I think more importantly, the Department of Justice identified them as part of the Muslim Brotherhood's Palestine Committee, which is Hamas.
So those organizations in place, so you're speaking, when you wrote this piece, these people in Minnesota, you mentioned very high-level elected officials working with these organizations, you are identifying because you know the history that they are jihadists in some connection, but they're working with them without knowing that. Isn't that right? I mean, they think that they are somehow doing good, doing the best thing you can do in America to help. I mean, aren't they being duped, I'm getting at?
So I don't know. I would like to hope that the governor, lieutenant governor, and the mayor and the U.S. attorney and the sheriff and others were just ignorant. But that means they're ignorant to the point of being incompetent. And here's why I say that. And in some cases, I would argue criminally negligent. Mm-hmm. And let me explain why. Our law specifically says, for instance, for a doctor or lawyer, if you do something that's unprofessional, you can be cited certainly by the bar association or something for unprofessional conduct. If somebody dies as a result of your unprofessional conduct, legally that can be charged criminal negligence.
As a doctor, you're saying, yeah.
Yeah, something like that. And people actually, when I was in the FBI, I actually sat in some of those with regards to pharmaceutical, malpractice, and all these kinds of things, and drug abuse, and a doctor acting. Well, if you're the governor of Minnesota and you're creating policies for the state, working with people, and they're hostile, and they're jihadis, and you don't know that, you don't get to say, well, I just didn't know. You have a professional duty. The oath of office comes with the legal standard to know or do due diligence to know all enemies. Now, here's where it kind of breaks down even farther. In the case of the sheriff, he not only said, I'm working with this particular imam, I'm making policies for the department. And he lists out some of them. He's publicly listed out what he's done. And then we see that these are jihadis, and that's the problem.
Yep. Okay, I'm torn because I want to get to more of the story. I have, for our listeners, I made a clip of Sheriff Stanek. He actually testified in a hearing in Washington where many people began using the expression, instead of talking about Islamic aggression or Islamization, they used CVE, which is countering violent extremism, was trying to pull away or disassociate the violence connected with Islam from the teachings of Islam. So CVE, he gave a testimony, but I think I want to skip it but basically he said in his testimony, yeah, I'm the sheriff here in Hennepin County. I'm trying very hard to build a bridge with all these Islamic groups. So he made buddies with Imam Roble. Is that his name? Roble?
That's his name.
Yeah, Imam Roble. And he's been telling me, now Imam Roble is telling me, the sheriff, what to do. And so I make policies, plans. I work with the Islamic community, the Somali Islamic community in Minneapolis, following the instructions of this Imam Roble. And so that's what he essentially did. I want to be sure we get to your story. If I play that clip, it's going to be too long, I think. So.
Okay.
Okay.
So I think what the next step is, if we look at what happened when he becomes sheriff in 2007, right, going forward until he just left office in 2018, Hennepin County, which is essentially the Minneapolis area,
yep,
we see no suicide bombers before a sheriff coming from Minneapolis. Minneapolis, Hennepin County, becomes the home of the first American suicide bomber who goes overseas to become a suicide bomber. And over the next 10 years, while he's sheriff, from his county, almost 24 jihadis and suicide bombers leave Hennepin County to go fight. I would say that is a catastrophic failure on his part.
Yes.
And for him to actually say, and he did it in open court, that his program was, magnificent and worked, is disconnected from reality, but it also demonstrates that this is what you get when you work with jihadis. You get a sheriff who's so attached to his jihadi master that he's actually willing to publicly say, in the face of all evidence contrary to what he's saying, that we have a great successful program. Disregard the 24 jihadis that came from my county since I've been sheriff.
It is truly breathtaking. No one else would count that as a success. I mean, when you point to that outcome, that you had jihadis in the very region he says, we're establishing great relations because Imam Roble is telling me how to do it. And it was very, the clip is very boastful. That's how I felt about him. Just boastful. I figured it all out, and I'm doing the greatest thing ever. But anyway, he's built the way to interact with these Somalian immigrants and Muslim immigrants in his area is to work with an imam. At the same time, the community is sending jihadists overseas to kill people. Okay, but I want to move on to your trial. So you ran into this sheriff again in Reno, and just glossing over you were at some event in Reno. It was a sheriff's presentation.
Right.
And this sheriff, whom you had written about in this article, again, called "In This War, Minnesota's Twin Cities Are Lost," you wrote about him, his record of failure. You run into him in Reno, and in a summary way, what happened?
So I had never met him before. We walk in to do the National Sheriff's Conference in Reno, July 2017. We walk into the room, or end of June, we walk into the room, and he had just finished a presentation. So I recognized his picture, I introduced myself, and that was the end of it. And he asked, I'd like to speak with you. Would you meet with me after? And I said, okay.
Seemed friendly.
That was the end of it. He did not seem friendly, but it was just kind of blank.
Okay.
And so after we're done presenting, his guy's waiting for us, says, hey, you still willing to meet the sheriff? We said yes. We walk over there. And as soon as we sit down, I actually asked if we could begin in prayer, and he said no. And he turned his iPad around and said, I want to talk about this. And he had the article pulled up, and he was already pretty angry. And he basically said, he said, this stuff's all false. You're saying things that aren't true. And I said, what's not true? And if you can show me what's not true, can you show me? And he was very upset with a couple things. First, I thought was very odd. He said the picture of him and President Obama had been photoshopped, which is weird because I got it off the Minneapolis Star Tribune website. And it was
Yeah.
also on the White House website. But anyway, that notwithstanding, I said, what's untrue? And he's like, well, you say, the threat exponentially grew when I was, whatever. And
He had no facts to counter. He had no facts he was incorrect.
he just was angry. And when I made it clear that I was not going to retract the article as it stood unless he could show me there were some facts missing that were incorrect or something that was not factual. And at that point, he began attacking me personally. He attacked my military, or certainly this is the way I took it, my Marine Corps, the fact I was a combat veteran. He attacked my FBI career. And then in the end,
it got a little physical.
He's made some very rude comments. He stood up. I stood up, eventually the rest of the table, and he stepped into me. He chest bumped me. I pushed him back. As soon as I did, he grabbed my tie, and he was literally strangling me. It turned into a brawl, and it was broken up, and that was the end of it. As far as I was concerned, it was two guys having a dust-up. Well, he tried to charge me criminally in Reno, Nevada, which obviously went nowhere because he assaulted me first, but there were certainly no facts that I assaulted him. And then he sued me civilly, and he's been suing me civilly for the last year and a half, and that trial just ended 2 weeks ago here in Dallas.
It did. And you know what? I wish we had an hour to have you tell listeners a lot of things about the trial. It would cause you deep upset to recognize our judicial system has fallen to the point of how this trial went. But I want to focus on one thing. There was something you told me about the testimony where he was asked, I don't know if it's by your lawyer or his lawyer, essentially, the sheriff who initiated the altercation, who didn't like your article pointing out his failure in actually handling the Islamic threat in Minneapolis. But he's asked a question on the stand, essentially, why did you bring this litigation? What was his answer?
So it was his attorney. It was the last question he was asked while he was testifying. Why did you bring this forward? And he said, to silence that man, he pointed to me, and to shut down UTT, understanding the threat. Because he was convinced that we're just, what we're doing is just, wrong from his perspective.
I got to tell you, that is such a great way to close this interview. We'll have to do another time with about the trial. But what he's saying is the same attitude the Southern Poverty Law Center has, the Anti-Defamation League has, is if I don't like what you're saying, you can't say it. He sued you over this, dust up between two grown men. He's a lot physically bigger than you. Dust up between two grown men. But he said in the trial, the bottom line was, I want to shut you up. And maybe it's just too hard a question to ask you, but what is the mindset in his worldview? It's like he's just embarrassed because all of this work, he's suddenly seen all this work he did building this Islamic community relation made him look foolish because you pointed out, and all the jihadis are coming out of your district. I mean, or is it just kind of that I can't be wrong at this point? Maybe I don't have an answer for that, but I think it's bizarre why he even brought it.
So I do have an answer. My experience in the last, certainly while I was still in the FBI, I saw this, but, over the years, whether it's a 3 or 4-star general, a senator, a congressman, a mayor, a police chief, a sheriff, a pastor, these relationships and especially this one he formed with Imam Roble and a couple others that he works with what I call, suit-wearing jihadis. The whole purpose of these jihadi leaders building this relationship with leaders in the community like Sheriff Stanek, once they make that and build that relationship, that individual is going down with the ship. They have married their entire professional reputation to this individual, and they will never break it, and they'll go down kicking and screaming. We have seen it across the board.
Okay, John, we're going to have you back another time. I mean, I always say that too. But again, we'll have to have you back another time. Thank you for taking time today to come in. It's just a fabulous window on you recognizing what's happening in Minnesota, you exposing it, and he's kind of epitomizing what the civilizational jihad is all about.
Oh, he's a classic example.
Yeah, he's an example of someone who's been completely manipulated by a civilization jihad where he thinks he's the good guy as he stands up for Islam.
And they said that in court. He's good, I'm evil. That's what they said in open court. That's the way it works. And if I could just encourage people that want to learn more, understandingthethreat.com is our website. I appreciate you putting all those links on there, but I certainly encourage people to go sign up for our newsletter, and you will get not only the articles, but a lot of other information through what we do.
Yeah, I'm going to encourage listeners to. I love their website, understandingthethreat.com. You can learn so much, and things you learn there that you will not hear in mainstream media, to say the least. John, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks very much for having me,
Thank you.
Debbie. Really appreciate it.